When the Civil War drew to a close in 1865, it did so in an America that had been shattered by violence. At least 620,000 were dead, with modern estimates suggesting it was closer to 750,000, by far the deadliest war the US has ever fought in. Whole swaths of the South had been economically ruined. Great cities had gone up in flame. It was, in short, a pretty awful experience, one you would think no one would ever want to repeat. Yet polling tells us that a modern repeat of the Civil War is exactly what many Americans think will happen. YouGov reports that 43% estimate internal conflict is anywhere from somewhat likely to certain in the coming decade. Over half of self-described strong Republicans and 40% of strong Democrats say it's on the cards. So, with the recent movie Civil War still in theaters, now seems like a good time to dive into this, to ask what a sequel to America's deadliest conflict would really look like.
Well, you're American, okay? Okay. What kind of American are you?
Almost no experts believe it will involve vast armies clashing by night. Instead, a modern civil war would likely be a far stranger and far more horrifying affair than you could ever imagine. To an alien monitoring Earth, only through the media, it might look like civil conflict in the United States is inevitable. Household name politicians appear on TV calling for a national divorce. Polling shows a quarter of respondents want their home state to break off from the Union, while over 4 in 10 think a conflict is coming. Bestseller lists carry titles like How Civil Wars Start, which warns the US is already sliding towards bloodshed, and The Next Civil War, whose author has declared the United States is a textbook example of a country headed towards civil war. Reviews of the recent movie complain it's not half as alarming as the real war already underway. In short, a whole lot of Americans seem to feel this will be the decade in which they pick up their guns and set off to murder their fellow countrymen. And it is an assumption we'll mostly be following in today's video as we try to imagine how such a thing might actually unfold. Before we get into that though, we do need to make one thing clear. A massive war erupting in the United States in the near future is incredibly unlikely. Unlike most nations that go up in flames from Sudan to Myanmar, the US is neither in economic freefall, just emerging from dictatorship, nor stuck with an army that often meddles in politics. As The Economist has written, America is not like the former Yugoslavia or other imploding states. No country as sophisticated, modern, liberal, and democratic as contemporary America has ever descended into civil war. Nor is the country at an unprecedented crisis point. While Alexander Reed Ross, an academic who studies political violence, has told The Telegraph that a low-intensity conflict could have been feasible amid the lockdowns, riots, and contested election of 2020, things have since simmered down. Historically, the country has weathered far greater periods of division, like the unrest of the civil rights years, without turning into one big battle royale. So, yeah, take everything you hear about an upcoming American conflict with a whole shaker of salt. The point of this video is mostly to run a half-fun, half-serious thought experiment, not to suggest that you should go out right now and stock up on ammunition. That being said, there are enough signifiers to suggest something is rotten in the US body politic that makes pondering a second American Civil War seem relevant in a way that pondering a Canadian or Australian one just isn't. Back in the Trump years, The New Yorker interviewed Keith Mines, a guy who'd worked for the State Department navigating multiple civil conflicts around the globe. Looking at the US, even pre-2020, Mines concluded there was a 65% chance Americans would be fighting one another on the battlefield within 15 years. Although an outlier, his number wasn't the only startling one floating around. In 2017, Foreign Policy asked groups of national security experts to rate the chances of an upcoming internal conflict and received a chilling average of 35%. In explaining himself, Mines gave a list of 5 conditions he felt many countries experienced before fighting started. To quote him, entrenched national polarization with no obvious meeting place for resolution, increasingly divisive press coverage and information flows, weakened institutions, notably Congress and the judiciary, a sellout or abandonment of responsibility by political leadership, and the legitimization of violence as the in-way to either conduct discourse or solve disputes. If that description feels a tiny bit like modern America to you, you just might understand where Mines was coming from. Yet, not everyone agrees these are the only triggers required before everything erupts. Were the USA to become the next Yugoslavia, you'd expect to see other stuff in place. Stuff like a weakening dictatorship that is alien to today's America, but also stuff like extreme media polarization that's already scarily evident. In her 2022 book, How Civil Wars Start, the academic Barbara Walter writes that Countries are more vulnerable to civil war when they are somewhere between dictatorship and liberal democracy. In our telling, internal conflicts rarely ignite in true democracies because people can express their dissatisfaction at the ballot box. Equally, they're unlikely to erupt in strong dictatorships, since the dictator will simply round up and shoot the insurrectionists. The danger comes when local democracy is weak and discredited, but there's no strong force at the center to keep people's anger in check. Does that describe the modern United States? Certainly there's feelings of deep mistrust in institutions, but America remains a functioning democracy in which even the 2021 Capitol riot was ultimately followed by a swift transfer of power. Likewise, it's hard to see much evidence of one of Walter's other potential flashpoints, factionalism, either religious or ethnic in nature. The Economist writes that, quoting, "Since the end of the Cold War, perhaps 75% of civil wars have been fought between ethnic and religious groups rather than political ones. Here, what matters is not how diverse a country is, but whether politics revolves around identity." End quote. A prime example of this is Yugoslavia, where the post-communist era was marked by the rapid rise of ethno-nationalist parties. More recently, the Tigray War in Ethiopia erupted when the political party of one ethnic group began to clash violently with the central government. In today's America, such ethnic sorting is rare. White people vote for both Republicans and Democrats, and while the Democrats hold an advantage among non-white voters, more Black and Hispanic voters have begun moving towards the GOP in recent years. On the other hand, there's evidence that long-term religious sorting is underway. Since the 1980s, those with strongly held Christian beliefs, especially evangelicals, have moved ever more firmly into the Republican camp. That could potentially lead to a fusion of religious and political identity, akin to what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But with no rival religious group embracing the Democrats, it does seem less likely. The next item on Barbara Walters' list, though, is much more ominous. According to her research, media bubbles can turbocharge the arrival of bloodshed. In most of her examples, these bubbles were made worse by the poison cocktail of ethnic tensions. The Facebook algorithms amplified anti-Rohingya content in Myanmar at the height of the genocide, the Serbian TV channels that claimed Bosniaks were literally feeding Serb babies to lions in Sarajevo Zoo. But while ethnicity and religion aren't playing such a large role in today's America, you don't have to look very hard to find grotesque claims on social media. Just substitute the word Serb and Bosniak into that last example for Republican or Democrat, and you will easily be able to find something equally disturbing. Then there's the way social media can amplify group fears by spreading images seemingly designed to spark panic or rage. Just think back to all those videos flying around at the height of the protests and riots in 2020. The way they convinced people living far from the that gun-toting racists or Antifa activists were about to show up at their homes and kill them. Not that social media alone could push an entire nation into meltdown. It would have to combine with some other factor, possibly something like Walter's last flashpoint, when a large group fears it is losing status. The big example here are Sunni Arabs in Iraq, who went from being the elite under Saddam Hussein to outsiders during the post-war occupation. It was from military men among their numbers that Islamic State would find its most effective soldiers, turning IS into one of the deadliest insurgent groups of all time. These, then, are the flashpoints we should be looking for if we fear a new civil war. Ones that don't necessarily revolve around big divisive issues like slavery or abortion, but rising tensions and mutual loathing between different factions. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's now turn our attention to perhaps the more interesting question. Once it has erupted, what does a second civil war actually look like? Back in the Trump years, when Civil War II discourse was at its peak, pretty much every article on the subject cautioned that a future conflict wouldn't feature large armies and vast battles. After all, that just wasn't the way such things unfolded in the 21st century. As the New Yorker wrote, quote, "Today, few civil wars involve pitched battles from trenches along neat geographic front lines. Many are low-intensity conflicts with episodic violence." With hindsight, of course, that sentiment looks laughably wrong. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Myanmar have all since suffered catastrophic civil conflicts in which gigantic armies faced each other on battlefields. In the fall of 2022, it was estimated that 1 million soldiers were in active combat in the Tigray War alone. Still, despite the resurgence of civil wars fought on an industrial scale, there are good reasons to think a second American showdown would be different. The main one being that there's no longer the clear geographic divide we saw in 1861. While large chunks of the South and Midwest reliably vote Republican and many coastal states reliably vote Democrat, the internal makeup of individual states is a lot more mixed. Deep red Texas, for example, has big clusters of blue voting districts, while sky blue California harbors large pockets of overlooked Republicans. Now, can you imagine a hypothetical far future in which voter sorting has become so extreme that all the Texan Democrats have moved to California and vice versa? Well, yeah. Probably. But right now, the geography is a lot more muddled than it was in the run-up to 1861. All of which is why the smart money is still on some sort of insurgency as the more likely option. As to what that insurgency would look like, well, history offers us a couple of useful models. But the one thing experts stress is that we, in all likelihood, wouldn't see it coming. Before most conflicts break out, countries go through what the CIA's Guide to Analysis of Insurgency calls the pre-insurgency stage, the part where different groups are radicalizing, recruiting, and stockpiling weapons on the scale needed to fight a war. Oftentimes, this can be done so deeply in the shadows as to be near invisible. It wasn't until days before the Easter Rising in 1916 that the British state realized many of its Irish subjects were going to try and throw off their shackles. Other times, it might be out in the open, but that doesn't mean we'll recognize the warning signs. The Economist tells the story of cosmopolitan Yugoslavs in places like Sarajevo who were well aware that Serb militias were tooling up in the hills around them, but dismissed them as stupid yokels. Per the magazine, one local writer recalls city folk joking about rustic Serbs hating us because we knew about soap and water and wearing clean socks. Of course, that dismissiveness quickly changes once the spark is lit and the insurgency moves into its active phase. Speaking to The Telegraph, political violence researcher Alexander Reed Ross suggested the 2024 election as such a potential spark. But not just because of the threat of MAGA warriors taking up guns and attempting to restorm the Capitol. According to the paper, Ross believes that left-wing groups may also now tool up if trouble flares again. He fears the growth of American versions of far-left groups like Italy's Red Brigades, which killed nearly 50 people in kidnappings and robberies during the 1970s and 80s. In this telling, the spectre of police brutality from 2020 sent certain left-wing activists into a traumatic spiral, one which has nurtured a buried sense of grievance which could be reactivated if Republicans sweep to power. They quote Ross as saying, "I do worry that if Trump gets elected again, it could spawn new left-wing formations who will not be constructive at all." His comparison of today's far-left groups to Italy's Red Brigades also hints at a model for any such American insurgency: the years of lead. From the late 1960s through to the 1980s, Italy suffered a catastrophic spike in political violence, one in which the far left carried out murders, the far right bombed public places, politicians were assassinated, and parts of the military conspired to carry out coups. What made this era so violent wasn't just a proliferation of terrorist groups, it was the way far left and far right forces fed off one another, pushing one another to gruesome new heights. Foreign policy describes the dynamics this way. As the left grows more militant, influential, and strident in its demands, the right tries to inflame social tensions rather than diffuse them. In the years of lead, that inflaming of social tensions included a series of deadly bombings by fascist groups, including one at Bologna train station that killed over 80 people. Oftentimes, such as the Milan bank bombing of 1969, these attacks were designed to appear like the work of far-left groups, which only added to the general sense of confusion and paranoia. For experts like Ross, this is the sort of civil conflict America should fear, one in which a small number of heavily armed domestic terrorists carry out competing strikes with such regularity that panic spreads through society, further radicalizing people. As Politico notes, an army is not required to wreak sustained havoc and destabilize the country. In a deeply polarized environment, smaller pockets of armed unrest could easily ignite and spread disorder. Bad as they were, though, the years of lead aren't the only insurgency that might serve as a model for the next civil war. There's also the Northern Irish Troubles. For much of the back half of the 20th century, a low-intensity civil war waged in the United Kingdom, one that was often referred to not as the internal conflict it was, but by the euphemistic name, the Troubles. Taking place in Northern Ireland, the Troubles led to around 3,600 deaths and over 47,000 wounded. In the 3 decades it lasted, there were no set-piece battles, no Northern Irish Gettysburg. Instead, armed groups like the Provisional IRA and the UVF waged underground war via atrocities. Every day brought new tales of assassinations, terrorist bombings, kidnappings, as well as murder by the British security forces. The fighting was everywhere, but also nowhere, an often urban war that didn't destroy cities like Belfast so much as it annihilated their souls. According to some experts, this may be the most likely face of the new US Civil War, a bloody insurgency where opposing militias operate in the shadows, emerging only to bomb a department store or shoot a politician. The Telegraph refers to the work of Associate Fellow in the Americas program, Bruce Stokes, to paint a portrait of something similar happening in the US context, quoting, "While formal state versus state conflicts seem unlikely, what could happen is a messy Northern Ireland-style troubles. Rather than the conventional military forces, there would be gangs and paramilitary groups carrying out tit-for-tat killings." End quote. The prediction does have some flaws. For instance, the US is not divided along sectarian lines as Northern Ireland was, nor is there a large religious minority suffering state-sponsored discrimination, as was the case for Irish Catholics. But the point isn't that America could reproduce all of the horrors of the Troubles, just with more cargo shorts and different accents, but that a future US insurgency might copy the IRA's playbook. Not just with a campaign of bombings and shootings, but by embedding itself within a sympathetic civilian population. You might even get a reflection of the British state's dubious role in the conflict. The Telegraph notes that local sheriff's departments and the National Guard units in the USA are often fiercely independent from the federal government. Were the violence to escalate, you might find men with badges playing a clandestine role supporting one local group of extremists or another. Yet, even if the violence were to reach levels comparable to the Troubles, it's doubtful that many Americans would wind up having direct experience of it. Northern Ireland is a small place, with a population during this era of barely 1.5 million. Even so, the majority of people, especially those living outside hotspots like Belfast, never experienced any violence firsthand. The book, Troubled Geographies, talks about how deaths were concentrated in certain parts of Northern Ireland, which meant that the traumatic impact of the conflict was disproportionately felt by relatively few communities. This is what a comparable American insurgency would be like. Something that 90% of people wouldn't witness with their own eyes, but via TV and social media. Not that this would lessen the impact, though. Picture for a moment how tense you get after a series of mass shootings, how the wall-to-wall coverage creates an undercurrent of anxiety for days afterwards. Now imagine those shootings, plus bombings and assassinations, are happening week in, week out, for years on end, all broadcast on TikTok and X by insurgents who want you to see and be terrified by their violence. It would be a psychological war, a war designed to leave you exhausted and numb, one that you could never be certain wouldn't hit your hometown, your community, your family when you least expected it. All sounds pretty grim, doesn't it? And the worst part could be how long such an insurgency might last. The Years of Lead ran for over 20 years. The Troubles continued for 3 decades. But if you think these models of conflict sound bad enough, be warned that there are some who think a future American implosion could be even worse. Rather than a low-intensity conflict or a long-running insurgency, these analysts predict something far more horrifying: the collapse of the United States into pure anarchy. When we talk about a potential American collapse, there is one key thing that we need to bear in mind, which makes the United States different from Italy, Ireland, Myanmar, Syria, or almost anywhere else that's experienced recent civil conflict. That one thing is guns. The piles of high-powered guns in private hands that most other nations only have in small quantities. CNN estimates there are 393 million privately held firearms in the US. As the network notes, that's more than one per person. It's also more than in perhaps any society that has recently collapsed into internal conflict. This potentially creates some interesting outcomes. Rather than have to go underground and become experts in bomb making and gun running, potential insurgents already have a lot of the kit they need to cause mass casualty events. Equally worrying, their opponents can easily buy the exact same weapons if they wish to exact revenge. This is the fear at the heart of this model, the one that suggests the US could go beyond insurgency and into widespread chaos. The theory goes something like this. Attacks carried out by insurgents start to escalate, which leads to their opponents stockpiling their own powerful weapons. At some point, an attack on a particularly sensitive target, say a church or an abortion clinic, sparks a violent backlash from the other side. Politico describes what could happen next. A contagion of localized but widespread tit-for-tat violence could produce mass abdications on the part of local law enforcement and overwhelm the capacity of the federal authorities, turning expanding pockets of US territory into essentially Darwinian enclaves. End quote. This is the big worry of people who study these sorts of things, that America could get into a cycle of reprisals. Reprisals aimed not at the perpetrators of previous atrocities, but entire groups, whether they be ethnic or political. This would supercharge things like nothing else. The fear that the group you are a part of might be hurt or brutalized by the other side is a powerful driver of violence. As a wise puppet once noted, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering, or as Politico puts things, large-scale civil collapse need not involve the concentrated efforts of a critical mass of people. Purposeful militias aren't required, only spiraling acts of violence by small numbers of people that may originate spontaneously, but fueled by retaliation, develop their own momentum. End quote. The example their piece gives is the collapse of Somalia in the 1990s. In an interview with Vice in 2020, the extremist researcher and journalist Robert Evans suggests a cycle of reprisals might blow up into something like the early months of the Syrian civil war, or when things were more chaotic and localized than they later became. And, well, we shouldn't disagree, these guys are the experts after all. But rather than look to Somalia or Syria, we want to instead look to another horrific civil war, one that erupted not in Europe, Africa, or the Middle East, but in the Americas, one that also didn't feature strong ethnic or religious divides, but did feature self-described liberals and conservatives massacring one another on an eye-watering scale. A civil war known as La Violencia. Taking place in mid-20th century Colombia, La Violencia struck just as the country was deep in a period of extreme partisanship. Liberals believed that conservatives were plotting a coup. Conservatives thought a liberal takeover of government would leave them permanently disenfranchised. Nobody realized how bad these divisions had gotten until the spark was finally lit. On April the 9th, 1948, the populist leader of the Liberals was assassinated in Bogota. His supporters rioted for 3 days, destroying the capital and killing over 3,000 in something known as the Bogotazo. In the aftermath, liberal and conservative-controlled media issued calls to arms. Politicians denounced the other side, blaming their rivals for the carnage. Out in the countryside, dormant militia groups activated. In no time at all, Colombia was in anarchy. Egged on by media outlets and demagogues, ordinary people committed the worst kind of atrocities. In small towns, the local ruling party would round up everyone affiliated with their opponents and execute them, dumping the bodies in mass graves. There were reports of liberals using the severed heads of conservatives to play soccer, of conservatives cutting out the eyes and tongues of every liberal in their district. For 10 full years, this wild killing spree continued, a civil war with no clear boundaries and no obvious armies. By the time the liberals and conservatives put aside their partisanship and instituted a power-sharing agreement, over 200,000 people had died. Now, we should be clear that the circumstances that led to La Violencia were extremely specific. Colombia in 1948 was utterly unlike America in 2024, not least because the country had already fought several civil wars within living memory. Still, we bring it up now as an example of just how south things can go in a nation when people stop seeing their neighbors as countrymen and start seeing them as the enemy. The good news is that a second American Civil War almost certainly won't happen in the near future. As the New York Times notes, in any given year, only 4% of the countries that meet the conditions for war actually descend into one. At the same time, though, we should also keep in mind what John Quincy Adams' grandson, Henry Adams, once said of the original. Not one man in America wanted the Civil War, or expected, or intended it. We can only hope that decades from now, another famous figure won't look back on our own era and say something eerily similar.